but some geological implications next week, atmospheric, some pretty interesting stuff to consider in view of what we are about to study here tonight. So, all right. Genesis chapter 7, the beginning of the flood, starting here in verse 7. Let's do this. Somebody read for us Genesis 7, 7 through 12. We'll start there. All right, so we're going to start here. We're going to figure out this timeline. 600th year, 2nd month, 17th day. Is that right? Okay. 600th year of Noah's life in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month. All right, that's vital information. So this period of grace and long suffering is over. God said sometime back, my spirit is no longer going to strive with man. I'm going to send a flood and destroy every living thing off the face of the earth. So we know that information. Of course, I put in here 1 Peter 3 and verse 20. Only 8 souls were saved by water, according to that text. If we follow the dating of life in Genesis 5 precisely, and I can't see any reason why we shouldn't view this as a literal timeline. The time of the flood, your first blank, is 1,656 years after creation week. Now we know, all right, we're not naive, that does not in any way fit the Darwinian evolutionary timetable, does it? Not even close. I don't know what 1,600 is compared to 4.6 billion, but it's not much, is it? What? 1656. 1,656 years. So that's my question. All right, why should we doubt the literal timeline? Somebody read Genesis 5:18. Okay. You've got Jared mentioned. Over in Jude chapter 14. Jude chapter 14. How many chapters does Jude have? Not 14. Thank you, Jeff. Verse 14 of the only chapter of the book of Jude. Enoch is referred to as the 7th from Adam. So you have a New Testament author inspired by the Holy Spirit verifying the timeline at least from Adam to Enoch, right? The 7th from Adam. So if that's literal, why wouldn't I understand the years between Adam and Enoch as literal? There's no reason not to accept this in that way. 1 Chronicles 1 through 4 is a reiteration of these first 10 generations from Adam, Seth, Enosh, Cainan, Mahalalel, Jared, all the way down through Methuselah to Noah. All right? You've got at least 3 biblical texts that repeat this genealogical timeline. And then I say here as well, Genesis 7:11, which, looking up here, 600th year, 2nd month, 17th day of the month. And then Genesis chapter 8, verses 13 and 14, very specific. There's no reason not to take this literally. When a Christian does that, the Christian is often viewed as anti-science because, evolution is settled, we're told. But anyway, rain was on the earth for how many days and nights? 40? All right. We're going to figure out this timeline tonight. I think we should be impressed with the magnitude this catastrophe that occurs here. I suppose most of us have seen local flooding. I remember one time we were in Pensacola. It rained for, man, I forget how many hours straight, nonstop, and heavy rain. And you know, down there in Florida, you'll be driving around and you'll see these, I call them retaining ponds. They'd usually be fenced off, big holes in the ground to catch water. We had one across from our subdivision, and it blew that, I've got a picture of it. It blew that thing apart like nothing. Within a matter of hours, changed the way that looked completely. Rains on the earth for 40 days. All right, so let's talk about this. In Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11, you've got two things mentioned here. You've got the fountains of the great deep being broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So let's think about these fountains of the great deep for just a minute. You go back to the creation account, and Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, it says, the earth was without form, and it was void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. It seems that in the initial stages of creation, you have water, then you have land. And we'll talk about that. I've got some slides to put up. We'll talk about that a little more in detail as we go through. Somebody turn over to Psalm 104. Who's going to get this one for us? Who wants to read Psalm 104, verses 6 through 9? All right, Jay's got that one. Who wants to get 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6? All right, Miss Sharon's got that one. Read them when you get there. Psalm 104, 6 through 9, and 2 Peter 3, 5 and 6. All right, the only way I can see that passage is in the context of the flood. They go over the mountains. He talks about the recession. They recede out, that they may not return to cover the earth. Notice that at Psalm 104, verse 9, which implies that one time they did cover the earth, right? So you have, again, just like the timeline, the dating of these early biblical characters, in the same manner, the Bible addresses this idea of a universal flood, worldwide flood. 2 Peter 3, 5 and 6. The earth standing out of the water and in the water. That's a lot of water. All right, go ahead. Okay. The world that existed then perished, being flooded with water. Again, note that the reason we're reading these verses is to emphasize the worldwide nature of these events. All right, this is not a localized Mesopotamian flood. And one reason we're going to lay out this timeline is to help us see that too. You know, I don't know, it was a year or two after we moved here, we had just a ton of rain, and Spring River was essentially at the bottom of the bridge down here. You guys remember that? I do. It was quite something to see. Anyway, those things happened within a matter of hours with rain. Imagine 40 days and 40 nights of not just the windows of the heavens being open, which we're going to talk about here shortly, but also the fountains of the great deep. You know, it is very well known that there's water all under us that we can't see, all over the world. So, yes. Yeah. With this, and we're going to talk about that next week, the geologic implications of the flood, of the fountains of the great deep, volcanoes. I mean, there are still active today underwater volcanoes that are constantly spewing. I mean, Hawaii, there's constantly active volcanoes. So we think of things, we experience things that happen, let's say, within a day, within a 12 to 24-hour period. You've got 40 days and 40 nights of this nonstop, of not just rain, but stuff coming out from under the earth too. And that's the import of 2 Peter 3, 5, and 6. the earth standing in the water and out of the water, and it was destroyed by the water. So, notice the language here. Genesis chapter 7, look at verses 19 and 20. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. Notice that language. Doesn't the Bible talk about mountains at times? Didn't the ark land on the mountains of Ararat? Verse 20, 15 cubits upward did the water prevail, and the mountains were covered. I believe, now I can't prove this 100%, but I believe that our mountain ranges, the canyons that we see, all of that stuff was probably much smaller pre-flood because of all the force that's coming up from these great fountains of the deep. Like I said, we'll talk about that more next week. Then verse 23, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things, and the fowl of the heavens. And they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So again, all we're doing right now is just laying the foundation. This is not, there's no way based on biblical language that this is a localized Mesopotamian flood, which is what a lot of people, it's like we've talked about with evolution. It's like we as Christians feel, and I'm using the accommodative we here, just in general. It's like we feel sometimes we have to apologize for the Bible because this is just too hard to believe. And you know, there's all these scientists that say nothing like this ever happened. And even 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about those who are willfully ignorant of things that happened in the past. They say, well, you know, where is the promise of His coming? Since the beginning of creation, all things have continued as they were. But they were willfully ignorant of at least Noah's flood. So, anyway, so 3 blanks right here in a row. Let's deal with this. Number 1, the first blank here is the purpose of the flood. Somebody read Genesis 6:13. All right, we know that. We've covered that, but just reiterating the fact, this is judgment. This isn't just a flood for the sake of a flood. God is destroying mankind because man has, as the text also says, has filled the earth with violence. Every thought of his heart was only evil continually. This is an act of divine judgment here. Number 2, you've got the depth of the flood, which I've already read in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 20, 15 cubits. Okay, so if a cubit is 1.5 feet, what's 15 cubits? About 20 foot? Somewhere in there? Like I told you, it had been 2 weeks ago. The measurements of a cubit historically are anywhere from 17 to 22 inches. Essentially, it's like tip of the finger to the elbow, basically. So, at minimum, according to the biblical record, at minimum, the water's 22.5 feet. Let's take that measurement above the highest mountain. All right, so we know the depth. Now let's talk about the duration. This is where this is interesting because the biblical language is pretty clear here, but we need to be impressed with the magnitude of it. All right, so 22.5 feet. So essentially anywhere from 20 to 25 feet, depending on which cubit measure you use. That's what it would be. The depth of the flood. All right. So 40 days and nights. Isn't that what chapter 7, verse 12 tells us? And so basically from verse 12 of Genesis 7 down through to 23, you've got the description, right? They get into the ark. The animals, and by the way, did you notice, whoever, I don't remember who read it to us, but they get into the ark, verse 9, talking about the animals. I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Noah didn't have to go out and gather all these things. There's no question in my mind that there was some miraculous activity here. Animals don't just flock to a boat, a male and a female, and just get on board. So, the God who created the world is also capable of this. So, like I said, basically verses 7 to near the end of the chapter, we have the description of what happened. The waters prevailed, increased greatly, verse 18. Verse 19, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, high hills were covered, etc. Verse 22, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. Notice the emphasis there, of all that was in the dry land. They didn't have to take any fish in the ark, obviously. They'd be fine. All right, so verse 24. Somebody read verse 24. All right, the waters prevailed for 150 days, but we've already been told of the 40 days and the prevailing from verses 12 to 22. So basically what you've got here then is 110 plus 40. That's your 150 days of prevailing. And at this period in time, and looking back at history, they're running by a lunar calendar. You've got approximately 30-day months, 12-month years. So 150, that's 6 months. You've got 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Windows of heaven are open. The fountains of the great deep are opened up. And for a total of 150 days, the waters are prevailing on the earth. Okay, somebody read chapter 8. I'll tell you what, let's do this. Chapter 8. I'll just start reading in verse 1. God remembered Noah. That's an interesting word, if you like to make notes in your Bible. The Hebrew word for remember, and it's significant because the way it's used in other passages too, is Z-A-K-A-R, zakar. And it's an action term. It's not that, like, you put your keys down and, oh, I remember where I put them. It could literally be translated, and God took action on the behalf of Noah, or on behalf of Noah. I'm going to destroy the earth. Okay, that happens in the 150 days where the water's prevailing and everything dies. So God takes action for Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. God made the wind to pass over the earth and the waters assuaged. Notice this, the fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped. So this was an ongoing thing. We tell our kids the story of the flood, and we tell them it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But that is, a little play on words here, that's pretty shallow, isn't it? There's a lot more to the flood than that. The waters, verse 3, returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of 150 days, the waters abated. So you've got this 150 days is repeated. From everything I can tell, it's talking about the same period of time. They're prevailing and they're abating within this 150 days. All right. Now, verse 4, you get to verses 4 and 5. The ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. So they rested at the end of 150 days. All right, so if you're looking, I've got this stuff on the paper, but I thought I would put it up here so we could see it together. That's approximately, well, if you're running by a 30-day month calendar, 74 days from what we've been told. All right? So you add 74 to 150, and you've got, 224 so far. Somebody read verse 6, chapter 8, verse 6. All right, after 40 days, they open a window. Open the window. Okay, so there's another month and week, essentially. What does he do when he opens that window, according to verse 7? Sends out a raven. Verse 8, he sends out a dove. And what you need to notice here to help us figure this timeline, look at verse 10, the first part of verse 10. And he waited yet another 7 days. So there are 3 times where he waits 7 days and he sends out these birds. So you've got 21 more days for that stuff going on, according to the text. The doves are sent out, etc. That's verses 8 through 10. And it says it again in verse 12. He waited yet another. So it says that twice. All right, so it came to pass. Somebody read verse 13 for me. All right, so we go from the 600th year in the second month and the 17th day to the 601st year, the first day of the first month. If you're looking at the outline, that's the next event that's recorded. So counting from 7/11 to 8/13, if we're following a 30-day month calendar, you've got up to this point 314 days. You say, well, how do you say 285 on your outline? Well, there are some days that there are no events recorded, and so we just have to essentially do some math. So at this point, we've got 224, 264. Am I adding right? 264 plus 21. You've got 285 days right here with what's recorded from chapter 7, verse 12, on into chapter 8, through chapter 8 and verse 10. So 285 days. And then you have the next date that we just read there in chapter 8 and verse 13, meaning 29 more days passed after what we've read here. So 285 plus 29, 340. People are like, well, who cares? What does this matter? Because we tell the story of 40 days and 40 nights. And that's not even half true. It did. But the flood, the entire event of the flood is like, it's often presented as it rained for 40 days and 40 nights and they got off the ark. And that's not what happened at all. It's much more catastrophic than just that. So look then at chapter 8 and verse... Somebody read chapter 8 and verse 14. All right, so if it's the first day of the first month, and you've got 30 days in a month, to the second month and the 27th day, you've got a total there of 57 days, which, when you add all that up, comes out to 371 days. I tried to lay it out in the outline as best as I could, and I brought this in here so maybe we could just see the numbers being put together, but at least a year this event took place. No, because the waters start to abate, what is the word? Look down at chapter 8 and verse 3 and 4. Yeah, decrease. Yeah. It did, yes. Yes. But there's much more to it than that. The flood event itself is so much more than 40 days and 40 nights. And again, I kind of want to emphasize that next week, looking at some geology and some environmental implications too. Did I see a hand come up over here? Yes. Yeah. Well, all right. So you brought that up, and that's what we're going to talk about next. The evidences, fossilization and rapid fossilization. And we talked about that somewhat in chapter 1, but it's interesting, so I want to revisit it for just a minute. You know, we talked about the earth's atmosphere. You know, you remember God created the heavens and the earth, and He created the firmament, going back to Genesis chapter 1. And you had waters that were under the firmament and waters that were above the firmament. You guys remember what the word firmament means from chapter 1? Anybody? Expanse. It's like one of the definitions is stretched outness. It's the heavens. Now, there are different heavens. I'm not getting into all that mentioned in the Bible, but you've got 2 Peter 3 that Sharon read earlier. You've got Genesis chapter 1. You've got the earth. You've got its atmosphere. And then you have, according to the biblical record, you have water that is outside of the firmament, above the firmament, in fact, is what it says there in Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. Now, this is modern, what our atmosphere looks like, the different levels, the different thicknesses of our atmosphere, and it is quite different than what it used to look like. And one of the interesting things is when you start looking at this from a Christian perspective, you'll also start noticing that evolutionists agree with this, but their timeline is much different. Their timeline is millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years, as opposed to what the biblical data reveals. All right? You guys remember these pictures? Pictures of you can see essentially the atmosphere at certain angles in photography. Angles from space, certainly. Okay, so fossils. I wanted to bring this in because you've got all these things dying. And again, not just the animals and humans, but like you said, trees and fern. Everything that grows on the earth dies, except for what's in the ark. And so you've got fossilization happening quickly. And I don't... okay, Antarctica. What can you tell me about Antarctica? It shouldn't have this. Should it? Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what goes on in Antarctica. Military bases and secret operations and all this stuff, but they shouldn't have this. And see, that's one of the problems with evolution. The evolutionary theory is uniformitarianism. Everything has always continued the same. There's been no worldwide deluge, no worldwide catastrophe. Well, then you have to explain fossilization in, I don't know if it's the coldest place on earth, but one of the coldest and most barren places on the planet. All right? These are all from Antarctica. Ferns. How do you explain ferns and massive trees from that continent? Of course, you've got, and I don't remember, I had notes on this when we were doing Genesis 1, but even in the Rocky Mountains, the Swiss Alps, you've got constant fossilization of fish in the mountains. And again, whatever happened here, biblically, we know it's the flood. This is rapid fossilization. They didn't die in water and float around and eventually fall. This is very quick, a very quick process to fossilize these things as it's been done and as it's constantly found. There's another one. Anyway, okay, what is this? You guys remember what this is called? The continents are all one. You remember? Pangea. Okay. You could debate this. I believe it. I believe that this was the case because it's too perfect. Not just the way it looks. Okay. Sure, you may have had to manipulate a couple of little things to make it fit perfectly, but one of the issues with that is the same rock layers on the borders of the continents, the same trails of fossils. If you put it all back together, the fossil, what they refer to like fossil graveyards, they just follow. Well, if it was always like that and everything's separated, how do you explain fossil trails that line up perfectly with what we refer to as Pangea looked like? It just doesn't make sense. So continental drift, the idea that the continents are slowly spreading apart, the estimate is the continents move at approximately 4 centimeters per year. If it's the case that they went from this to this at a consistent rate of 4 centimeters per. Somebody show me. I don't know. What is 4 centimeters? Jay, something like that. 4 centimeters per year. How many years would it take them to separate as far as they have? I don't know how many miles are between America and Europe. I know it takes a long time to fly. It's 600 miles an hour. Well, if you believe in that, that's going to fall into the evolutionary geologic timetable, because 4 centimeters a year, that's going to take a lot of years to make the expanse that it's made. And then again, you still have to deal with the fossil record and fast fossilization, not over long periods of time. The flood? Oh, there's no question about it. Yeah. Well, and that's my point. So when these great fountains of the deep open up, this is no little event. Okay. How many of you are familiar with Reelfoot Lake in West Tennessee? I don't know if you've heard the stories of was it 1812, the earthquake it diverted the Mississippi River. Okay, you can divert a creek, you can divert a stream. Imagine diverting the Mississippi River and causing it to flow backwards in some locations. And a lot of other things that took place. That happened in a matter of days. And it caused a massive sinkhole in northwest Tennessee and up into Kentucky that is now Reelfoot Lake. So if a thing like that can happen in a matter of hours, think about something that for at least 150 days the water is rising and stays at the same level, and then after 150 days you have rapid erosion. If you live along creek banks, river banks, they can erode rather quickly, can't they? You get a heavy enough rain, maybe if you don't have good, what's the word? You put trees along to preserve it. Riprap, all right? If you do that, you can preserve it, but if you don't have that, you're going to get erosion, and sometimes it can happen pretty quickly. Back to the Earth's atmosphere here. All right, so let's think about this. Back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. Final bullet point here. There's no rain before the flood. So far as we have in the biblical record, that's what we were told, right? Except that the Lord God had caused a mist to rise and to water the face of the earth. The rainbow itself was a post-flood. I don't know if creation's the right word, but God's covenant to Noah was, I will put my bow in the cloud. Well, we know how are rainbows caused. What produces that? Typically it's raining and the sun is shining somewhere. And it's reflection. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, all right? But I'll put my bow in the cloud. This is post-flood. So if it is the case, and I've got this picture up here, and like I said, even evolutionists believe in this, but their timetable obviously is much different. If there is this canopy of water, you've got the water on the earth, the firmament around the earth, and then the waters above the firmament, if that's the case. Here are a couple of results. We talked about this in Genesis 1. Number one, you've got a worldwide even temperature or climate. And again, looking back at those fossils that you're finding in Antarctica, fish in high mountain ranges, again, ferns and trees in what are now essentially unlivable climates. The obvious implication of that is, at one time it was a livable climate. And everything that we have in the biblical record indicates that there was that type of environment. I mean, so back in Genesis 2, God's describing the Garden of Eden. But the creation is, at that point in time, is uniform. It's the same everywhere. It's just the emphasis is in Genesis 2 and where he put Adam and Eve. All right? So you've got a worldwide climate / temperature. Number two, you would have, and that's this illustration here, a barrier to harmful UV radiation from the sun, ultraviolet radiation, with uniform temperatures. There would be no ice caps. There would be no barren deserts. You wouldn't have to worry about that. There wouldn't be any shifts in seasons like we see. It's constant and it's uniform. But then you have this catastrophe where, again, and I think it's significant there in chapter 7 and verse 11, the windows of the heavens were opened. Seems to me that this indicates that water that was above the firmament was dispensed, let's say, during the flood. And I put it in here. There are even many evolutionists. I actually read a couple articles today on that. Evolutionists agreeing to this water vapor canopy theory. So after the flood, according to biblical data, man's lifespan was greatly reduced. Well, maybe. How many of you have heard of a hyperbaric chamber? What is there any health benefit to a hyperbaric chamber? Higher pressure? Well, if you've got a uniform environment, you've got higher pressure, there would be some health benefits to that. But now, if all of that's gone, that's going to have a negative effect on man. Lifespans are going to be reduced. Melanoma, anybody ever heard of that one? You don't have this protective barrier, water vapor canopy, outside to protect us, essentially. You don't have that anymore. The average age of the antediluvians, and that's a fancy word of meaning the people who lived before the flood. The average age, if you exclude Enoch, because Enoch didn't die, he was translated at 365, is 912. I'm thinking of Abraham. Wasn't he 175 when he died? I think Moses was 120. You see after this event, after this catastrophe, that lifespan is greatly reduced. And maybe, if we take the biblical record literally, maybe God meant what He said when He said, "The day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." There are going to be dire consequences if you eat of that tree. Well, it certainly would have been possible for God, okay, this is something to think about and where we'll close real quick. It certainly would have been possible for God to have brought about the flood miraculously. No question about that. I don't think He did. Now, getting the animals to the ark, that's another story. But the flood itself, you look at chapter 7, verses 11 and 12, this is a catastrophe that's caused with a natural explanation. However, with the description of the original creation and the statements of 7, 10 through 12, it seems that God used what was in nature to cause this worldwide flood. And there are many implications, again, geologically and environmentally, because of the flood. And that's what we're going to hit on next week. I know I talked most of the time tonight, but there was a lot of information. And save your questions for next week or for after Bible class. Well, surely there was, because even at Eden, there were 4 riverheads that came together. But in the original creation, the land mass was in one place, and it says He gathered the waters into one place. So, yeah. All right, guys, thank you.